Latin America attracts a lot of people for the great lifestyle, but it's not known for being a tax-friendly place. And yet our own tax terminator says it's becoming more tax-friendly than even Southeast Asia. Today, we're going to break down his top 5 tax-friendly countries in Central and South America. You've seen the Tax Terminator on the Nomad Capitalist R&D channel. You've seen him speak at Nomad Capitalist Live, where Michelle McCory gave him that nickname. He and I love to sit around and just talk about taxes. I spend more of my time in Asia, but the truth is, Thailand, still tax-friendly, but not as tax-friendly as it used to be. Malaysia will still be tax-friendly, but there's rumors things might change in the future. Singapore is not as much of a territorial tax system as some people would like to believe. My colleague Javier shared his 5 favorite tax-friendly countries, and I'm going to count them down with you from number 5 to number 1. Starting with Paraguay, we recently showed you investment and real estate ideas there. There are a lot of nomad capitalists in Paraguay. It is affordable. It is a rather free place. I've said in some ways it is the Georgia of South America. For all the folks who went to Georgia, for all the years we've talked about it, Paraguay, it just feels like an up-and-coming place. It is number 5 on his list. They do have a tax-friendly regime where you can go and spend 120 days there in your first year. And become a tax resident, not pay tax on your foreign income, and then in years thereafter, you don't really have to be there that much, as long as you're not living somewhere else, generally speaking, more than 6 months. And so while that regime attracts people who want to keep a minimal physical presence in a country on an ongoing basis and live a rather nomadic lifestyle, Javier believes that for entrepreneurs who are operating a business, i.e., you're the CEO of your own company, operating a business in Paraguay, he believes, is less advantageous from a tax perspective with how their rules work than other countries in Latin America. So good if you're starting out, perhaps good for passive income. He believes it's good, but not as good for actually operating a business. And this speaks to a misconception people have that, let's say, a territorial tax system means nothing earned overseas is taxed. What you often can't do is say, hey, I'm living and working in Paraguay. I essentially have the job of CEO, but my salary is paid somewhere else, so you can't tax it. Work done in a country is looked at somewhat differently by different territorial systems, but he says Paraguay less favorable. Let's go to number 4, the Dominican Republic, of course, in the Caribbean. It is a 3-year fully territorial tax holiday. We've talked about this in some of our other episodes. And so that means for your first 3 years there, which is just about long enough to get citizenship if all goes well, which it often doesn't in the DR. That means you can get a second passport of decent quality, like a tier B- passport, with a fully territorial tax system. Once you get that passport, you would then have to leave. However, he thinks that unless you're in the DR's free zone regime, which is decent, it is not as solid as Uruguay or Costa Rica for territorial tax. And so when people look at free zones, I think there's, a lot of conversation about, going and setting up in the free zone. This is not like the Cayman Islands where everybody's living and working essentially in this, large free zone. In a country like the DR, the free zone is going to work better for some kind of larger company. If you're just running a business, even like Nomad Capitalist, you make decent money, but it's a relatively straightforward structure. It's just not going to be as advantageous for you. Number 3. Costa Rica. Costa Rica is one we've been monitoring for the last 4 or 5 years because there's been threats to their territorial tax system. Now remember, territorial means income earned in the country from local salaries, local incorporated businesses, rental incomes, perhaps dividends from stocks. Not all territorial countries tax dividends from stocks, but if they do, those local sources of income are taxed. Money you earn somewhere else is not taxed. So a territorial country is not going to tax your dividends from Singapore, meaning Singapore taxes the dividend at 0, and Costa Rica taxes a dividend at 0. The same thing applies to a public equity as well as stock in your own company. You can take dividends out generally tax-free. However, Costa Rica's territorial regime is rather strict. There was reform in 2023. We started looking at the talk of reform back in early 2021, where they were threatening to take away the territorial system and impose a residential system where if you live there, all of your income would be taxed. 2023 reform came. Part of that means any work performed in Costa Rica creates taxable income. Again, I think that there's some misconceptions around this where you can pay yourself, a minimum wage salary. Generally speaking, if you have a job, let's take the CEO example, you've got to pay yourself a reasonable wage. Now, it doesn't have to be the reasonable wage of the CEO of a major publicly traded American company, but, paying yourself 10 grand probably is not going to work. And so you've got to then segregate the work that you do and figure out what's that worth. And then you're going to pay income tax on that. So if you've got a company overseas that makes $10 million a year and you pay yourself a $100,000 salary and that passes muster, well, then sure, you're going to make, $10 million and pay, $25,000 in tax. Not a bad deal, but it's opening the door to potential, further tax. Costa Rica also has a free zone regime, but others are more competitive. If you want to be a tax resident of Costa Rica, which will help you open your bank accounts and brokerage accounts, you need a tax residence somewhere for most people. You have to spend those 183 days to get it. There are no shortcuts. There are no buy a property and we just give it to you. You're getting tax residence in Costa Rica by spending time. Number 2 on the list is Uruguay. Very business-friendly country. It's a favorite of a couple of my colleagues here. Javier says their system is still great.
You obviously have neighboring Uruguay. I've talked about Uruguay to some of you outside when we're discussing and talking beyond the ballroom setting. Uruguay is becoming increasingly attractive, especially as people want to be close to Argentina. It's a similar lifestyle, similar food, similar even accent when they speak, and Uruguay is very tax-friendly. Uruguay has been pushing to become ever more tax-friendly, so they're already doing a good job. I would hope that they continue to do a good job and maybe they'll roll out some kind of other incentive. They already have, as I mentioned earlier, an 11-year tax holiday for new tax residents, and those who are relocating to Uruguay for the first time have also the alternative of, if they don't choose the 11-year zero tax on foreign income, they can go for a perpetual rate of 7% on foreign income. So that's not a bad deal. You can get 11 years at zero, or you can get perpetuity at a very low rate. And I would expect Uruguay to maybe roll out some other types of incentives in the area.
And so in Uruguay, to truly live tax-free or essentially tax-free, you cannot rely on the regular system, but you have to take advantage of a special regime. And so we've told you before about an 11-year special regime, basically the first year plus a decade more tax holiday, where effectively you're going to pay no tax because you've got a pretty fully territorial regime. They also have a lifetime single-digit tax regime. However, for most people, 11 years is probably a safer bet. Maybe you get the passport in 3 to 5 years, and then you decide, hey, I don't want to live here anymore. I'm going to go somewhere else in South America where I now have greater privileges as a Mercosur country citizen. After 11 years, you might just decide, okay, I'll pay some tax. They do have free zones there as well. Most people, though, will take advantage of the special tax regime and generally the 1 plus 10-year regime where you're going to pay very, very little. But Javier's point is you can't simply move to Uruguay with no tax regime and lower your taxes as dramatically as his number 1 pick. And so you can simply live in Uruguay for 6 months a year, that 183 days. You'll get tax residence that way, no investment required. Or you can purchase $550,000 worth of property. There's some beautiful properties there in the water. They're going to cost more than $550,000. But if you buy just over $500,000 in property, you can have tax residence in Uruguay and essentially pay zero for those 11 years with as little as 60 days on the ground. And so perhaps you want to explore the rest of Latin America. Uruguay and Paraguay could be good options where, as long as you're not spending too much time in some other country, you don't have to spend that much time in Uruguay or Paraguay. He likes Uruguay's regime better because you can get into this special regime and you can basically just say, hey, for those years, I don't have to pay. Whereas in Paraguay or in Costa Rica, you have that income that comes from your active work in your business or your active work on some project. That will be taxable. In Uruguay, you can generally exempt that. Now, the number 1 tax residence for tax savings in Latin America from Javier is Panama. He loves it, calls it a very flexible tax system, very business friendly, and you can start a tax-free business there without hiring locals. You can't do that everywhere. Panama's territorial system is the most black and white, with income in most cases either falling into taxable income from local sources, so that's, again, your local salaries, your local dividends, your local rental income, or non-taxable foreign categories. And so you have to spend 183 days in Panama to get tax residence, but once you have it, you can stay in that tax net, which in some countries, being the tax net is a bad thing. You're in the French tax net, the German tax net, the American tax net, the Australian tax net, bad. Panama's tax net, it's pretty good because all that foreign income essentially is going to be tax-free. After your 183 days in the first year, you can keep in that foreign tax net as long as you don't establish tax residence somewhere else by spending so much time there, as long as you keep personal ties in Panama. And so he thinks that Uruguay is actually better if you want total travel freedom to make the tax residence work. But if you're willing to spend time in Panama, it is number one, in that pretty clearly there's all the foreign income will not be taxed. Now, you always want to analyze, what is it you do? Do you have a job? Do you do trading? Do you make decisions? What is it you do? Entrepreneur, investor, whatever you are, you want to analyze how each country's tax system applies to you. I told you the story. We had a gentleman who moved to Dubai for zero tax, not realizing most of his income was royalty income from books and music and YouTube, which is taxable in the U.S., where those royalties were coming from. And because the UAE has no treaty with the U.S. for tax purposes, he ended up paying more than he would have paid. He ended up paying far more in tax in Dubai than he would have living in, quote unquote, high tax Europe because of the source of his income. This is the kind of thing we help our clients figure out. Go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. We have not only people in-house who've done this before, they've got real-world experience, but we also have a network of hundreds of experts all around the world that we work with as, let's call them subcontractors of a sort, where we manage everybody working together. So you have one-stop shopping for your entire tax-saving, second passport getting, asset protection plan. Go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. Here's the cool thing about Panama is they have opened up and they are starting to process citizenship applications. For years, going back to 2015, I told you, don't rely on getting citizenship in Panama. Yes, if you spend 5 years there, you can apply, but every citizenship requires the president's signature. This is different than some kind of fast-track citizenship where only, big investors get citizenship. But every citizenship to be approved in Panama requires the president to sign off. And they just weren't doing that. Well, now they're clearing out the backlog, and it looks like there's some progress to where you could get a very neutral passport living in Panama. Same is true in Uruguay. Same is true in the Dominican Republic. Costa Rica, I think, is a bit more difficult. Same is true in Paraguay. So you've got 5 countries where you can live there. You can pay very little, if any, tax for anywhere from 3 to 11 years to forever. You can work towards pretty decent quality second passports, particularly in the case of Paraguay, Uruguay, and Panama. And so if you set up one of these structures, you can get a trifecta of great lifestyle, really low taxes, pathway to citizenship, and potentially in some of these countries, even if you don't want to live there full time, you'll have the flexibility to live a nomadic lifestyle. I spend part of my year in Colombia, but I don't spend nearly enough time there to trigger tax residence. I could have, if I wanted, tax residence in one of these countries like Paraguay, and then go and spend my time in Colombia, knowing that as long as I do things correctly, I'm protected by that Paraguay tax resident status. So you want to understand what tax residence means. It allows you to identify yourself to the world as where do you pay taxes, where do your bank accounts and brokerage accounts and everybody else report, as well as where you actually owe taxes. Doesn't mean you always have to live there, but if you do live there, it makes it easier. And there's a path to citizenship. Again, if you want our help, go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. Latin America does have more and more options for paying low tax.